Theories of international relation. Realism. Liberalism. Idealism. Marxism. Critical theory. Postmodernism. Constructivism. Feminism. Green theory. Domino theory. Hegemonic stability theory. Game theory. Theory of conflict prevention. International regime theory. According to realism, states work only to increase their own power relative to that of other states. Realism also claims the following: the world is a harsh and dangerous place. The only certainty in the world is power. A powerful state will always be able to outdo and outlast weaker competitors. The most important and reliable form of power is military power. A state's primary interest is self-preservation. Therefore, the state must seek power and must always protect itself. There is no overarching power that can enforce global rules or punish bad behavior. Moral behavior is very risky because it can undermine a state's ability to protect itself. The international system itself drives states to use military force and to war. Leaders may be moral, but they must not let moral consumes guide foreign policy. International organizations and law have no power or force. They exist only as long as states accept them. Politicians have practiced realism as long as states have existed. Most scholars and politicians during the Cold War viewed international relations through a realist lens. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union trusted the other, and each sought allies to protect itself and increase its political and military influence abroad. Realism has also featured prominently administration of George W. Bush. Machiavelli. One of the best-known realist thinkers was Niccolò Machiavelli. In his book The Prince, 1513, he advised rulers to use deceit and violence as tools against other states. Moral goals are so dangerous. He wrote that to act morally will bring about disaster. He also gave advice about how to deal with conflicts among neighboring states and how to defend one's homeland. Machiavelli's name has become synonymous with nasty and brutal politics. This vision of the world rests on following four assumptions. 1. Realists claim that survival is the principal goal of every state. Foreign invasion and occupation are thus the most pressing threats that any state faces. 2. Realists hold states to be rational actors. This means that, given the goal of survival, states will act as best they can in order to maximize their likelihood of continuing to exist. 3. Realists assume that all states possess some military capacity, and no state knows what its neighbors intend precisely. The world, in other words, is dangerous and uncertain. 4. World. It is the great powers, the states with most economic clout and, especially, military might, that are decisive. In these views, international relations is essentially a story of great power politics. Realists also diverge on some issues. Offensive realists maintain that, in order to ensure survival, states will seek to maximize their power relative to others. If rival countries possess enough power to threaten a state, it can never be safe. Hegemony is thus the best strategy for a country to pursue, if it can. Defensive realists, in contrast, believe that domination is an unwise strategy for state survival. They note that seeking hegemony may bring a state into dangerous conflicts with its peers. Instead, defensive realists emphasize the stability of balance of power systems, where a roughly equal distribution of power amongst states ensures that none will risk attacking another. Polarity. The distribution of power amongst the great powers is thus a key concept in realist theory. For realists, the international system is defined by anarchy, the absence of a central authority. Waltz. States are sovereign and thus autonomous of each other. No inherent structure or society can emerge or even exist to order relations between them. They are bound only by forcible coercion or their own consent. In an anarchic system with no hierarchical authority, realists argue that law can only be enforced through state power. Thus states may create international law and international institutions, and may enforce the rules they codify. However, it is not the rules themselves that determine why a state acts a particular way, but instead the underlying material interests and power relations. International law is thus a symptom of state behavior, not a cause. Offensive realism. Offensive realism is a covering term for several theories of international politics and foreign policy that give analytical primacy to the hostile and unforgiving nature of the international system as the cause of conflict. Like defensive realism, some variants of offensive realism build upon and depart from Waltz's neo-realism. Offensive realism holds that anarchy, the absence of a worldwide government or universal sovereign, provides strong incentives for expansion. All states strive to maximize their relative power because only the strongest states can guarantee their survival. They pursue expansionist policies when and where the benefits of doing so outweigh the costs. States face the ever-present threat that other states will use force to harm or conquer them. This compels them to improve their relative power positions through arms buildups, unilateral diplomacy, mercantile, or even autarkic, foreign economic policies, and opportunistic expansion. Ultimately, every state in the international system strives to become a regional hegemon, a state that enjoys a preponderance of military, economic, and potential power in its part of the globe. Offensive realists, however, disagree over the historical prevalence of hegemonic regional systems and the likely responses of weaker states to would-be regional hegemon, e.g. balancing, buck-passing, or bandwagoning. Liberalism. Liberalism believes that individuals should be free from arbitrary state power, persecution and superstition. It has advocated political freedom, democracy and constitutionally guaranteed rights, and privileged the liberty of the individual and equality before the law. Liberalism has also argued for individual competition in civil society and claimed that market capitalism best promotes the welfare of all by most efficiently allocating scarce resources within society. To the extent that its ideas have been realized in recent democratic transitions in both hemispheres and manifested in the classical realism, also called human realism and associated with Morgenthau's exposition of realism, in which the power pursuit propensity of statin in derived from the basic nature of human beings as power maximizers. This perspective holds that ideological, as well as material, factors may constitute power, e.g. power over public opinion, and hence has some social underpinning. Collective security. Employed during the construction of the League of Nations, the concept of collective security goes beyond the pure idea of the defense to include, according to Inez Claude, arrangements for facilitating peaceful settlement of disputes, assuming that the mechanisms of preventing war and defending states under armed attack will supplement and reinforce each other. Writing during the Cold War, Claude identifies the concept as the post-World War I name given by the international community to the system for maintenance of international peace, intended as a replacement for the system commonly known as the balance of power, 1984–247. Most applicable to widely inclusive international organizations such as the League and the United Nations. Ideally, the arrangement would transcend the reliance on deterrence of competing alliances through a network or scheme of national commitments and international mechanisms. As in collective defense, collective security is based on the risk of retribution, but it can also involve economic and diplomatic responses, in addition to military retribution. From this, it is theorized that perfected collective security would discourage potential aggressors from angering a collectively of states. Like balance of power, collective security works on the assumption that any potential aggressor would be deterred by the prospect of joint retaliation, but it goes beyond the military realm to include a wider array of security problems. It assumes that states will relinquish sovereignty and freedom of action or inaction to increasing interdependence and the premise of the indivisibility of peace. The security that can be derived from this is part of the foundation of the neoliberal institutionalists' argument. Globalization of the world economy. Liberalism remains a powerful and influential doctrine. It emphasizes that the broad ties among states have both made it difficult to define national interest and decreased the usefulness of military power. Liberalism developed in the 1970s as some scholars began arguing that realism was outdated. Increasing globalization, the rapid rise in communications technology, and the increase in international trade meant that states could no longer rely on simple power politics to decide matters. Liberal approaches relations are to international, also called theories of complex interdependence. Liberalism claims the following. The world is a harsh and dangerous place, but the consequences of using military power often outweigh the benefits. International cooperation is therefore in the interest of every state. Military power is not the only form of power. Economic and social power matter a great deal too. Exercising economic power has proven more effective than exercising military power. Different states often have different primary interests. International rules and organizations can help foster cooperation, trust, and prosperity. Example: relations among the major Western powers fit a model of complex interdependence very well. The United States has significant disagreements with its European and Asian allies over trade and policy, but it is hard to imagine a circumstance in which the United States would use military power against any of these allies. Instead, the United States relies on economic pressure and incentives to achieve its policy aims. One of the most prominent developments within liberal theory has been the phenomenon known as the democratic peace. First imagined by Immanuel Kant, the democratic peace describes the absence of war between liberal states, defined as mature liberal democracies. Andrew Moravcsik has developed a more general liberal theory of international relations, based on three core assumptions. 1. Individuals and private groups, not states, are the fundamental actors in world politics. Right-pointing arrow, non-state actors. States represent. 2. States represent some dominant subset of domestic society, whose interests they serve. And idealism. Idealism is so widely defined that only certain basic tenets can be described. Idealists believe strongly in the effective power of ideas, in that it is possible to base a political system primarily on morality, and that the baser and more selfish impulses of humans can be muted in order to build national and international behavior that foment norms of peace, prosperity, cooperation, and justice. Idealism then is not only heavily reformist, but the tradition has often attracted those who feel that idealistic principles are the next step in the evolution of the human character. One of the first and foremost pieces of the old world and old thinking to be tossed on the trash heap of history by idealism is that destructive human institution of war. War, in the idealistic view, is now no longer considered by either elites or the populace of the great powers as being a plausible way of achieving goals, as the costs of war, even for the victor, exceed the benefits. 3. The configuration of these preferences across the international system determines, Moravcsik, concerns about the distribution of power or the role of information are taken as fixed constraints on the interplay of socially derived state preferences. Liberal theories are often challenging for international lawyers, because international law has few mechanisms for taking the nature of domestic preferences or regime type into account. These theories are most useful as sources of insight in designing international institutions, such as courts, that are intended to have an impact on domestic politics or to link up to domestic institutions. Democratic peace. All democratic peace theories seek to explain the disputed empirical fact that two constitutional democracies have never gone to war with each other in recent history, 1816 onwards. As such, they rest on a similar hypothesis that relations between pairings of democratic states are inherently more peaceful than relations between other regime-type pairings, i.e. democratic versus non-democratic or non-democratic versus non-democratic. To prove the reality of the democratic peace, theorists such as Michael Doyle have sought to show a causal relationship between the independent variable, democratic political structures at the unit level, and the dependent variable, the asserted absence of war between democratic states. Critics, such as I.D. Oren, dispute the claims of democratic peace theorists by insisting that there is a liberal bias in the interpretation of democracy, which weakens the evidence. Integration theory. It is based on functionalist theory of Richard Haas and neo-functionalist theory of David Matrani. It believes that cooperation in one area leads to cooperation in other areas. EU formation is based on this theory. Collective defense. Though the term existed before 1949, a common understanding of collective defense with regards to NATO can be found in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Marxism. In the mid-1840s, Marx and Engels wrote that capitalist globalization was seriously eroding the foundations of the international system of states. Conflict and competition between nation-states are the main fault. Lines and future looked certain to revolve around the two principal social classes: the national bourgeoisie, which controlled different systems of government, and an increasingly cosmopolitan proletariat. The outline of a radically new social experiment was already contained within the most advanced political movements of the industrial working class. Through revolutionary action, the international proletariat would embed the Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity in an entirely new world order which would free all human beings from exploitation and domination. Marx and Engels, 1977. Marxism has been the foil for their argument that international politics have long revolved around competition and conflict between independent political communities, and will do so well into the future. Realists such as Kenneth Waltz claimed that Marxism was a second image, account of international relations which believed that the rise of socialist as opposed to capitalist regimes would eliminate conflict between states. Its utopian aspirations were bound to be dashed because the struggle for power and security is an inescapable consequence of international anarchy which only third image analysis can explain. Waltz, 1979. Critical theory. Critical theory refers to a set of Marxist-inspired critical analyses of international theory and practice. International relations have been particularly inspired by the German critical theonaut, Jürgen Habermas, who emphasizes the intimate connection between knowledge and interests. Knowledge always serves someone or some purpose. Knowledge is also a social and historical product, which cannot be separated from its context. Critical theory recognizes that it in itself a product of society, but at the same time it tries to distance itself from society in an attempt to understand and change it. By doing so, it scrutinizes the existing social order and the boundaries of knowledge. To engage in critical theory is to perform a theoretical and a political act. In his effort to create an alternative foundation to positivism, Habermas distinguishes three knowledge-constitutive interests which he derives from various aspects of social existence. The first are technical cognitive interests. These are motivated by our material needs for existence, which lead to an interest in prediction and control of the environment. This interest constitutes the empirical, analytical sciences. Second, Habermas identifies practical cognitive interests, which are generated by the desire for increasing mutual, intersubjective understanding. This interest led to the development of fields of. Marxists had underestimated the crucial importance of nationalism, the state and war, and the significance of the balance of power, international law and diplomacy for the structure of world politics. New interpretations of Marxism have appeared since the 1980s. The perspective has been an important weapon in the critique of realism, and there have been many innovative attempts to use its ideas to develop a more historically aware conception of the development of modern international relations. For some, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the triumph of capitalism over socialism marked the death of Marxism as social theory and political practice. In the 1990s, some argued that the relevance of Marxism had increased with the passing of the age of bipolarity and the rapid emergence of a new phase of economic globalization. Gamble, 1999. A biography of Marx which appeared in the late 1990s argued that, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, his analysis of how capitalism breaks down Chinese walls and unifies the human race had finally come of age. Wien, 1999. For others, the resurgence of national security politics since the terrorist attacks of 9/11 is a simple reminder that Marxism has little grip on the most fundamental realities of international politics. Assessing these different evaluations of Marx's writings and the contributions of Marxism is the central purpose of this chapter. Study that are concerned with the meaning of language, symbols, norms, and actions. The third category consists of emancipatory cognitive interests, derived from the human ability to engage in reflective reasoning. Through the process of self-reflection, we can perceive society as a site of power struggles which constrain the realization of human potential. We have an interest in liberation. Emancipatory cognitive interests constitute critical theory. Hagerman's emphasis on emancipatory interests does not mean that any theory that promotes emancipation is true. Because he does not accept that anything goes, some independent criterion of validity, a theory of truth is needed. Habermas's concept of truth is established by rational consensus. What is true is what is agreed to be true, but this consensus must have specific rational features, otherwise truth loses all meaning. Among others, Robert Cox has drawn on critical theory in the study of international relations. Cox affirms the connection between knowledge and interests. Furthermore, he stresses the need for reflexivity. He distinguishes two perspectives on theory depending on its purpose. The first is problem-solving theory, in which theory serves as a guide to find solutions to problems from the point of view of, and within, its own framework. The second is critical theory, in which the presumptions of the theory itself and the process of theorizing are reflected upon. To do so means to open up the possibility of choice. It is then possible to choose a different perspective which involves different presumptions and seeks to realize different values from problem-solving theory. Critical theory questions the dominant world order by taking a reflective stance on the framework of this order. By doing so, it also questions the origins and legitimacy of political and social institutions and the way they change over time. History is perceived as a continuous process of change. Critical theory seeks to determine which elements are universal to world order and which are historically contingent. Andrew Linklater, another leading critical theorist, questions of inclusion and exclusion are central to international relations. He is not in favor of the system of sovereign states, because of their exclusionary character. Instead, Linklater advocates a community of humankind. Therefore, he wants to construct new forms of international postmodernism. The postmodernism paradigm believes in the arbitrary nature of modernity. It subscribes to the notion that the existing arrangements were merely created by human beings and that what is conceived to be the truth is in the actual sense a choice made by a predecessor. That is, it denies the notion of objective truth. According to postmodernists, the truth and knowledge of reality depends on our perception and representation of reality. Postmodernism is often identified with postpositivist theories that condemn the mainstream international relations due to the uncritical nature of its assumptions. A fundamental postmodernist critique of the neorealist and neoliberals is that they tend to create foundations for their theories in the fear of collapsing in IR and hence ascribe to positivist social science. The problem with positivism is that they give a limited view of international politics since they solely rely on observable facts while ignoring unobservable, such as socially created cross-border structures. Constructivism, on the other hand, claims to have seized the grounds in international relations by emphasizing on intersubjective creations in the international society. In its analysis of state-centric constructivism sees states as an individual or agent determined by norms, practices and identities. Postmodernism, however, goes further by providing alternative historical narratives to the formation of states and identity concepts. By engaging in their deconstruction, postmodernism is able to question these concepts that the constructivism paradigm accepts as given, hence engaging more critically with the norms and practices that it describes. Postmodern analysis to international affairs varies incredibly due to the widespread appropriation of ideas from various disciplines. However, these diverse methodologies are held together by the idea of deconstruction. Deconstruction involves exposing and undermining assumptions and ideological underpinnings in order to demonstrate the possible multiple readings that can result from the text. Such Genealogy or study of the different historical accounts is very useful in understanding the formation of states and other concepts in the society. Rely 'tis as a onion. Certainly, there is a multiplicity of perceptions paladi behind wars. For example, there may be different on of historical interpretations to the Darfur conflict depending on the person's position or ethnic group. On the one hand, the different historical interpretations may complicate our understanding of reality, while on the other hand, paying attention to the different historical narratives may reduce our perception of exclusion. In this respect, the postmodernist approach appears to be open to listening and dialogue by paying attention to the itivist multiplicity of perceptions. This approach is very useful in conflict resolution. R2 with thee and to fear of S. That another illustrative example can be seen in the deconstruction of the September 11th attacks into two events. First, the U.S. being attacked in its homeland, and secondly, the Al-Qaeda attacks on the Pentagon and towers as a consequence of U.S. won by actions in the region and its support for non-Islamic regimes. Similarly, in deconstructing the Iraq War, we find that the Iraq invasion did not begin in 2003 but rather when George Bush, the former U.S. president, brought doubts to the UN about Iraq's capabilities of building weapons of latex while created of have. In the state as actices goes mass destruction. Identity, the arbitrary nature of modernity. Modernity, historical ruction. Concepts given as an S variation of these. The idea involves ands and refers to the path of progress whereby one is freed from superstition, ignorance and set of institutional ideas that shape destiny. Postmodernism, however, denies the idea of progress. The ideas of economic and political development to postmodernists are just modernist conceits imposed on the defeated and the weak. For postmodernists, there is no right or wrong ways of doing things, and modernity is viewed as arbitrary. Choice posing as truth. Postmodernism sees things as arbitrary choices that come from power and interests. That is, arrangements that do exist are in fact choices made by human beings either consciously or unconsciously. Such constructions are choices in the sense that there are many other arrangements that could have been selected. Against criticism. Postmodernism has been criticized on several accounts. First, it is seen as denying the general applicable moral principles. Secondly, the theory neglects more material production processes. The major criticism is in its self-contradictory nature. The idea that everything that exists is a social construct implies that postmodernism's perspective and projection of the world is also socially constructed and is therefore also temporal. Constructivism. Constructivist approach to international theory challenged the rationalism and positivism of neo-realism and neoliberalism, while simultaneously pushing critical theorists away from meta-theoretical critique to the empirical analysis of world politics. Constructivism is not a theory, but rather ontology, a set of assumptions about the world and human motivation and agency. Its counterpart is not realism, institutionalism, or liberalism, but rather rationalism. By challenging the rationalist framework that undergirds many theories of international relations, constructivists create constructivist alternatives in each of these families of theories. In the constructivist account, the variables of interest to scholars, e.g. military power, trade relations, international institutions, or domestic preferences, are not important because they are objective facts about the world, but rather because they have certain social meanings. This meaning is constructed from a complex and specific mix of history, ideas, norms, and beliefs which scholars must understand if they are to explain state behavior. For example, constructivists argue that the nuclear arsenals of the United Kingdom and China, though comparably destructive, have very different meanings to the United States that translate into very different patterns of interaction. Wendt, 1995. To take another example, Lane Johnston argues that China has traditionally acted according to realist assumptions in international relations, but based not on the objective structure of the international system but rather on a specific historical strategic culture. A focus on the social context in which international relations occur leads constructivists to emphasize issues of identity and belief. For this reason, constructivist theories are sometimes called ideational. The perception of friends and enemies, in-groups and out-groups, fairness and justice all become key determinant of a state's. Indeed, postmodernism is a very useful tool for analyzing international affairs since it challenges many ideas in international relations and is very strong in constructing arguments. However, it can't really offer solution to the problems that exist and has been heavily criticized for providing self-contradiction. Therefore, the study of international relations cannot be confined to postmodernist perspective alone. To get a more coherent picture and understand the various nuances and intricacies in international relations, it is important to amalgamate various ideas and theories. Nonetheless, postmodernism has made important contributions to the study of international relations. Behavior. While some constructivists would accept that states are self-interested, rational actors, they would stress that varying identities and beliefs belie the simplistic notions of rationality under which states pursue simply survival, power, or wealth. Constructivism is also attentive to the role of social norms in international politics. Following March and Olson, constructivists distinguish between a logic of consequences where actions are rationally chosen to maximize the interests of a state and logic of appropriateness, where rationality is heavily mediated by social norms. For example, constructivists would argue that the norm of state sovereignty has profoundly influenced international relations, creating a predisposition for non-interference that precedes any cost-benefit analysis states may undertake. These arguments fit under the institutionalized rubric of explaining international cooperation, but based on constructed attitudes rather than the rational pursuit of objective interests. Perhaps because of their interest in beliefs and ideology, constructivism has also emphasized the role of non-state actors more than other approaches. For example, scholars have noted the role of transnational actors like NGOs or transnational corporations in altering state beliefs about issues like the use of landmines in war or international trade. Such norm entrepreneurs are able to influence state behavior through rhetoric or other forms of lobbying, persuasion, and shaming. Keck and Sickink. Constructivists have also noted the role of international institutions as actors in their own right. While institutionalized theories, for example, see institutions largely as the passive tools of states, constructivism notes that international bureaucracies may seek to pursue their own interests, e.g. free trade or human rights protection, even against the wishes of the states that created them. Feminism. Feminist theory looks at international relations through the lens of gender inequality. Feminists examine gender stereotypes in international relations, and in particular how some assume that power is a male characteristic. Feminist theorists look at how these sorts of stereotypes affect actors in the international system. Breaking with the powerful bond among manly men, states and war. Feminist theories of international relations have proliferated since the early 1990s. These theories have introduced gender as a relevant empirical category and analytical tool for understanding global power relations as well as a normative position from which to construct alternative world orders. Together with a range of new perspectives on world politics, including postmodernism, constructivism, critical theory and green politics, feminist theories have contested the power and knowledge of mainstream realist and liberal international relations. Like these other contemporary theories, feminism shifts the study of international relations away from a singular focus on interstate relations toward a comprehensive analysis of transnational actors and structures and their transformations in global politics. Arguably, the political rupture created by the magnitude and significance of the events of September 11, 2001 has given new impetus to feminist perspectives on international relations. With their focus on non-state actors, marginalized peoples and alternative conceptualizations of power, feminist perspectives bring fresh thinking and action in the post-9/11 disentered and uncertain world. Until relatively recently, the field of international relations studied the causes of war and conflict and the global expansion of trade and commerce with no particular reference to people. Indeed, the use of abstract categories such as the state, the system, strategic security discourses such as nuclear deterrence and positivist research approaches effectively removed people as agents embedded in social and historical contexts from theories of international relations. This is ironic since the scholarly field emerged, following the end of the First World War, to democratize foreign policymaking and empower people as citizen. Green theory. Ecological thought addresses the interests of nature itself rather than only the interests of humanity in nature. Green theory captures this orientation in political terms of value and agency. Gooden, 1992. What is to be valued? By whom and how to get it? Green theory belongs to the critical theory tradition, in the sense that environmental issues evoke questions about relations between and among us and others in the context of community and collective decision-making. Green IR theory is more radical in nature compared to other theories of IR and is inspired by subjects rather than mere objects of elite statecraft. Feminist theory in IR can be divided into three groups: liberal, critical and cultural or essentialist. Liberal feminism. Liberal feminism intends to empower women and give them an equal role in society, especially in politics and at work. Its goal is to ensure complete gender equality between men and women without changing completely the way the society works or girls' and boys' socialization. The French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir can be seen as one of them. This theory was also one of the first to be expressed in 18th-century Europe by the leading French feminist thinker Olympe de Gouges and its British follower Wollstonecraft. This theory focuses on gender equality at work and in politics, promoting policies to ensure parity in parliament or in boards of directors. It has extended the concept of glass ceiling to gender issues. In IR, liberal feminists look at women in international politics and international economics. Critical feminism. Following the Marxist-oriented critical school, critical feminists want to change the society and focus on socialization. They showed not only those IR concepts are gender-biased and based on male assumptions and representations, but they show the way gender is central in IR. For example, Christine Chin linked the Malaysian modernity policies and the female domestic labor that allowed men and women from upper classes to invest in work and in developing the country. Without this woman force, often Philippine immigrants, Malaysia couldn't become one of the so-called new Asian tigers. features which explains its position towards the environment and thus towards shaping up the world politics. First is resource conservation, which aims to garner full interest in non-human world not just by understanding the economic use of the resources but their conservation also. Second is human welfare ecology, which recognizes the interests of non-human community. Third would be preservation, which is the right non-use of resources, and fourth is animal preservation, where it treats all species, ecosystems as a whole. 2. Decentralization of power. Nation-states are both too big and too small to deal effectively with sustainability, and thus decentralization is the order of the day. Thus authority is required, but not on a global scale but by small tightly bound communities which can address the environmental issues and efficient use of resources. One of the best-known slogans inspired out of green international relations theory on world politics is "Think globally, act locally." Global environmental issues happen on a global scale but can be handled by breaking down those very global powers so as to act locally on them by creating small political economies and self-reliant communities. Thus decentralization comes out as the main focus of Greens in their political stance. 3. Limits to growth. This feature explains that the root cause of the current environmental crisis is the unprecedented economic growth which has eroded the environmental resources to the maximum limit. The exponential economic growth. Domino theory. This theory was pronounced in the early 1950s by the U.S. government fearing the spread of communism in Asia, in the early phase of the Cold War. In essence, the domino theory argues that if one Southeast Asian state becomes Marxist, then this will trigger neighboring states into becoming Marxist and so on. Internal crises in Asian states coupled with their interdependence means that Marxist revolutions or insurgencies will occur and spread. This is akin to topping a row of dominoes. Foreign policy. The goals that state officials seek to obtain abroad, the values that give rise to those objectives, and the means of instruments which these are pursued. Fungibility. The extent to which one form of power can be converted into another. Hegemonic. Stability. Theory. The central idea of this theory is that the stability of the international system requires a single dominant state to articulate and enforce the rules of interaction among the most important members of the system. For a state to be a hegemon, it must have three attributes: the capability to enforce the rules of the system, the will to do so, and a commitment to a system which is perceived as mutually beneficial to the major states. A hegemon's capability rests upon the likes of a large, growing economy, dominance in a leading technological or economic sector, and political and population growth is reaching a point of crisis where the environmental resources would soon exhaust and thus limits to growth exist. Greens support this argument and say that exponential growth is impossible in a finite system. According to Dobson, technological innovations will not work. Exponential growth over the long run can have very damaging effect, and also the issues associated with growth are all interrelated. Green politics versus environmentalism. Environmentalism accepts the existing social, political, economic and normative pillars of world politics and tries to understand environmental issues within those pillars, whereas under green politics, these pillars are considered the reason as why environmental issues are there and thus look to challenge these pillars. Green international theory, by way of green political theory, concentrates on the need for political transformation worldwide. According to the Green stance on world politics, radical social changes are needed in order to address global environmental issues. Green political theory calls for reorganization of political economy and structure globally so as to intertwine the economic production and exchange which uses resources and thus transforms nature into it. Green politics has a number of features in common with critical approaches in international relations theory. Balance of power theory. As a theory, balance of power predicts that rapid changes in international power and status, especially attempts by one state to conquer a region, will provoke counterbalancing actions. For this reason, the balancing process helps to maintain the stability of relations between states. A balance of power system functions most effectively when alliances are fluid, when they are easily formed or broken on the basis of expediency, regardless of values, religion, history, or form of government. Occasionally a single state plays a balancer role, shifting its support to oppose whatever state or alliance is strongest. A weakness of the balance of power concept is the difficulty of measuring power. It may be global, regional or local in scope. Power back-end up by projective military power. An unstable system will result if economic, technological, and other changes erode the international hierarchy and undermine the position of the dominant state. Pretenders to hegemonic control will emerge if the benefits of the system are viewed as unacceptably unfair. High politics and low politics. Issues of high politics are weapons, deterrence, war, military, nuclear economic sanction, boundary dispute, etc. On the other hand, low and attraction. The success of soft power heavily depends on the actor's reputation within the international community, as well as the flow of information between actors. Thus, soft power is often associated with the rise of globalization and neoliberal international relations theory. NGOs or international institutions, besides state, could also use this power. The primary currencies of soft power are an actor's values, culture, policies and institutions, and the extent to which these primary currencies. Neither is it the case that all non-military actions are forms of soft power, as certain non-military actions, such as economic sanctions, are clearly intended to coerce and are thus a form of hard power. Hard power. Hard power is a term describing political power obtained from the use of military and/or economic coercion to influence the behavior or interests of other political bodies. This can be done through military power, which consists of coercive diplomacy, war and alliance using threats and force with the aim of coercion, deterrence and protection. This form of political power is often aggressive, and is most effective when imposed by one political body upon another of lesser military and/or economic power. Game theory. A decision-making approach based on the assumption of actor rationally in a situation of competition. Each actor tries to maximize gains or minimize losses under conditions of uncertainty and incomplete information, which requires each actor to rank order preferences, estimate probabilities and try to discern what the other actor is going to do. In a two-person zero-sum game, what one actor wins the other loses. If A wins 5, B loses 5, and the sum is 0. In a two-person non-zero or variable sum game, gains and losses are not necessarily equal. It is possible that both sides may gain. This is sometimes referred to as a positive sum game. In some games, both parties can lose, and by different amounts or to a different degree. So-called n-person games include more than two actors or sides. Games theory has contributed to the development or models of deterrence and arms race spirals, but it is also the basis of work concerning the question of how collaboration among competitive states in an anarchic world can be achieved. The central problem is that the rational decision for an individual actor such as a state may be to defect and go it alone, as opposed to taking a chance on collaboration with another state actor. Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. Thomas Friedman's theory that no two countries that both had McDonald's had fought a war against each other since each got its McDonald's. More specifically, Friedman articulates it thus: when a country reached the level of economic development where it had a middle class big enough to support a McDonald's network, it became a McDonald's country, and people in McDonald's countries didn't like to fight wars anymore. They preferred to wait in line for burgers. Anarchy implies not the complete chaos or absence of structure or rules, but rather than lack of a central government that can enforce rules. International regime theory. A perspective that focuses on cooperation among actors in a given area of international relations. An international regime is viewed as a set of implicit and explicit principles, norms, rules, and procedures around which actors' expectations converge in a particular issue area. An issue area comprises interactions in such diverse areas as nuclear non-proliferation, telecommunications, human rights, or environmental problems. A basic idea behind international regimes is that they provide for transparent state behavior and a degree of stability under conditions of anarchy in the international system. International regime analysis has been offering a meeting ground for debate between the various schools of thought in